Late May 1945, northern Germany. The war is officially over, but the air still smells of smoke and damp earth. Morning fog hangs low over a fenced Allied processing camp, broken only by the sound of boots on gravel and the distant crackle of burning debris. A group of German women stands in formation. Not soldiers in the traditional sense, no rifles, no medals. Yet every one of them wears a uniform stitched with symbols that once defined power, belonging, and purpose. Luftwaffe auxiliaries, signals clerks, anti-aircraft helpers, women who served the Third Reich in offices, barracks, and control rooms far from the front lines. An Allied officer reads an order. No raised voice, no anger, just procedure. The women are instructed to remove their uniforms. Jackets first, then armbands, insignia. The fabric is collected and carried toward a waiting fire pit. No speeches are made. No explanations offered. Some women hesitate, others comply quickly, eyes fixed on the ground. For years, this uniform had meant duty, protection, identity. Now, it is being reduced to fuel. As the first flames rise, the war ends for them in a way no surrender document ever could. And this moment, quiet, controlled, irreversible, was shaped by everything that came before it. Continue into the world that led to this order. By the time these women were standing inside Allied camps, Nazi Germany had already collapsed in every meaningful way. In early 1945, the Third Reich was fighting for survival on all fronts. In the east, the Red Army was advancing relentlessly through Poland and into German territory. Cities like Königsberg and Breslau were surrounded. Refugees flooded westward, moving faster than the collapsing supply lines. In the west, American, British, and Canadian forces had crossed the Rhine by March. The industrial heartland of the Ruhr was encircled. Germany's military structure was no longer holding together. To sustain the war effort, the regime had long abandoned traditional roles. Women had been mobilized on a massive scale. By 1943, hundreds of thousands were serving as auxiliaries across the Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe, and Kriegsmarine. They worked as radio operators, clerks, meteorological assistants, telephone switchboard operators, and anti-aircraft helpers. Many wore uniforms nearly identical to male personnel, complete with insignia of rank and national symbols. These uniforms were not symbolic gestures. They were instruments of order. Wearing them placed these women inside the military hierarchy of the Nazi state. They followed regulations, took oaths, lived within a closed system of obedience and ideology. For some, the role was embraced. For others, it was simply survival in a society that punished refusal. As Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany, they began encountering these women in large numbers. They were captured at airfields, communication centers, and retreat routes, often unarmed, often confused, still wearing the uniform of a defeated regime. The Allies now faced a problem they had not fully prepared for: what to do with uniformed women of the enemy's state. At a moment when the war had ended, but its symbols had not yet disappeared. That dilemma would shape the decisions that followed. When the fighting stopped in May 1945, The Allies were not only tasked with occupying Germany, they were tasked with dismantling it. This process went beyond disarming soldiers or dissolving military units. It extended into ideology, identity, and symbolism. The Allied leadership, particularly in the American and British zones, viewed the visible remnants of Nazism as a continuing threat. Uniforms, insignia, flags, and medals were not neutral objects. They represented loyalty to a regime that had just collapsed after 12 years of total control. Female German auxiliaries complicated this effort. Under the Geneva Convention, non-combatant personnel were still entitled to humane treatment, but their status remained ambiguous. Many were not front-line fighters, yet they had operated inside the military system. Allied officers noted that these women still moved, stood, and addressed authority as members of the Nazi order. Processing camps were established across occupied Germany. Here, prisoners were registered, interrogated, and classified. Denazification. Questionnaires were prepared. The goal was to separate committed party members from those who had served under obligation. But before paperwork could begin, there was a practical problem: the uniform itself. Allied command decisions were clear. Nazi uniforms could not remain in circulation. Allowing former personnel, male or female, to keep them risked black market trade, impersonation, or symbolic defiance. More importantly, it delayed the psychological break from the regime. So orders were issued. Uniforms were to be removed, collected, and destroyed under supervision, not stored, not repurposed, burned. For many of the women, this was the first moment they understood that their service, whatever its nature, was over in a way that could not be reversed. The state they had worn on their bodies was being erased in front of them. And soon they would be ordered to take part in that erasure themselves. For the women standing in those camps, the uniform was not just clothing. It had structured their daily lives for years. It told them when to wake, where to stand, how to speak. It offered belonging inside a collapsing world when ordered to remove it. Many experienced a sudden loss of structure. Without the fabric, there was no rank, no duty, no clear future, only uncertainty. Nazi ideology had fused identity with service. The uniform symbolized loyalty, discipline, and purpose. Burning it was not simply an administrative act. It was the forced acknowledgement that the belief system tied to it had failed. For women who had been raised under constant propaganda, this moment created a deep internal conflict between what they had been taught and what reality now demanded. From the Allied viewpoint, the decision was deliberate and controlled. This was not punishment, it was prevention. Removing uniforms eliminated the visual authority of Nazism and reduced the risk of resistance or impersonation. Officers documented that compliance, not humiliation, was the objective. The fire was meant to end a system, not provoke emotion. As uniforms were gathered and folded, the space between order and consequence narrowed. The women watched as their past was carried away, step by step, toward the waiting flames. For male prisoners, defeat often meant captivity after combat. For these women, defeat arrived without a battlefield. Their war ended in administrative silence. Many had never fired a weapon, Yet they were now facing the same symbolic dismantling of identity. The absence of violence made the moment more unsettling. There was no adrenaline, no release. Only compliance. History would struggle with how to categorize them. Some had actively supported the regime. Others had performed clerical or technical duties with little ideological conviction. In the fire, those distinctions vanished. Uniforms burned without labels. Guilt and innocence were not sorted here, only affiliation. Days earlier, the uniform had commanded obedience. Now it offered none. The women stood unarmed, supervised by guards who did not shout or strike. Power had shifted completely. Authority was no longer worn. It was enforced by silence and procedure. When the first uniform was thrown into the fire, there was no ceremony. The flames did not discriminate. Thread, insignia, and emblems disappeared together, marking the irreversible crossing from service to surrender. The burning began in stages, under guard supervision. Piles of uniforms were carried forward, jackets with Luftwaffe eagles, skirts with stitched ranks, armbands marked by symbols that had once demanded absolute loyalty. The fire was already prepared, controlled, contained, watched closely. No one spoke. Orders had already been given. Now came execution. Some women stepped forward without hesitation, placing their uniforms onto the flames and stepping back. Others paused, hands tightening around fabric that had followed them through air raids, evacuations, and collapse. A few closed their eyes before releasing it. The fire consumed everything evenly. Wool shrank, cotton darkened, insignia curled and vanished. The process was methodical, almost bureaucratic. This was not destruction driven by anger. It was erasure by design. Allied officers observed and recorded, noted compliance, noted distress. The goal was clear. No symbols of the Nazi military were to remain in civilian space. This moment was not about revenge. It was about finality. As the flames rose, something else burned with the cloth certainty. The structure that had dictated these women's lives was disappearing in front of them. Rank no longer mattered. Service no longer protected. When the last uniform from the first group was placed into the fire, the camp fell into a deeper silence. What remained was not surrender but exposure. When the fire died down, the women were no longer part of any military system. Without uniforms, they were issued civilian clothing or plain POW garments. The transformation was immediate and unsettling. Only hours earlier, they had belonged to an ordered structure, however flawed. Now they stood as individuals, stripped of visual identity, waiting for classification and judgment. Many later recalled this moment as more disturbing than capture itself. Arrest could be processed, interrogation could be endured, but the loss of uniform erased certainty. It signaled that no authority remained to shield them, not ideology, not rank, not the state. For Allied administrators, the result was effective. Camps reported calmer behavior. No salutes, no formations. The psychological break had occurred. Nazism no longer walked, stood, or spoke through regulated posture. This was not justice in the courtroom sense. It was transition, a forced passage from collective belief into individual accountability. The fire pits were extinguished. Ash was cleared. Paperwork resumed. The war continued on clipboards and forms, not battlefields. And for the women who watched the last embers fade, the future no longer followed rules they understood. What came next would not be shaped by orders but by consequences that stretched far beyond the camp fences. After the uniforms were destroyed, the women entered a different phase of captivity. They were processed through denazification systems designed to evaluate individual responsibility. Questionnaires asked about party membership, duties performed, and ideological commitment. Some were released quickly, classified as nominal participants. Others were retained longer, assigned to labor units, or transferred between camps. Unlike male POWs, many of these women returned to civilian life sooner, but not without consequence. Germany in 1945 was a landscape of ruins and suspicion. Former uniforms, even when gone, left invisible marks. Employment was difficult. Silence became survival. Few spoke openly about their service. Allied reports noted psychological withdrawal among female former auxiliaries. Without structure or recognition, many struggled to redefine themselves. There were no parades, no veteran status. Their war ended without narrative or honor. The destruction of the uniform had achieved its immediate purpose. Nazism no longer had a visible presence in their lives, but its shadow remained now internal, unspoken, and unresolved. As Germany attempted to rebuild, these women carried their experiences quietly, blending into a society eager to forget. In the months and years that followed, the memory of the fire lingered more than the uniforms themselves. Survivors often described a strange mix of relief and shame. Relief that the regime was gone. Shame that they had once been part of it, even peripherally. Post-war Germany offered no simple reconciliation. Many communities treated former auxiliaries with suspicion. Diaries and later interviews reveal women avoiding mention of their roles, hoping their compliance would be enough to protect them from judgment. For historians, these testimonies became key in understanding the gendered experience of defeat. A war concluded, not with bullets, but with bureaucracy and fire. In the Allied view, the act had been effective. Symbolic authority was destroyed. Security risks minimized. Denazification could proceed. Yet for the women, the trauma was enduring. The uniforms were gone, but so too was the framework that had defined their lives. Identity had to be reconstructed from nothing. As Germany slowly stabilized, these women quietly reintegrated. Some returned to families, some to work, some to exile. The fire, though small in scale, marked a definitive end. The Third Reich no longer walked in uniform. Its remnants existed only in memory, shame, and historical record. This moment, the burning of fabric and insignia, would become a quiet symbol of both defeat and transformation. A bridge from war into the uncertain peace. The fire that consumed the uniforms was more than the destruction of cloth and insignia. It was a turning point in human experience, a moment when belief, obedience, and identity were forcibly separated. For the women who stood watching, it was a lesson in impermanence. The structures that had once guided and protected them could vanish in an instant. This act revealed the subtle power of symbols. A uniform had commanded respect, loyalty, and fear. Its loss left not only bodies exposed, but minds unsettled. In those quiet ashes lay the moral complexity of war, the collision of survival, ideology, and accountability. No gunfire marked the end. No victory parade, only fire, smoke, and reflection. History remembers battles, treaties, and occupations. But sometimes it is in the small, deliberate acts, the burning of a uniform, the careful removal of symbols, that the human cost of conflict becomes most tangible. The women who lost their uniforms regained freedom, but at the price of certainty, structure, and identity. And so, in the quiet aftermath of destruction, the war ended not with triumph, but with understanding that the end of an era is often measured not in victories, but in what must be let go.